Hello, I'm Bas Hamer from Possum Labs, and today we'll be talking about the 7th tutorial in the Possum Labs DSL set. And what we're dealing with is the assumption that you're using the Possum Labs DSL English version, although in this particular video it doesn't matter a whole lot. So let's go over to Visual Studio. Alright. So in this version, we're dealing with the following schema. And it's a relatively simple schema. What we're dealing with is we have dealers at the top. A dealer has stores and inventory locations. And a store has users and inventory locations of items. And there's a many-to-many relationship between the stores and the inventory locations. It's a pretty simple system. We don't have any of the additional fields filled out. The reason for that is because they don't matter as much to this tutorial. What we're worried about is how do we build complex data. Now, you might wonder, why do you want to build complex data for your test cases? And the reason for that is that if you create new data for your test and a test fails, chances are that if you rerun the test and you recreate the same data, the test will fail again. So you have more consistent tests, you have less noise to deal with. And the other thing is that the failures you find are important failures because they're very small data sets which tend to apply to most customers. What can happen if you keep reusing some of the same things? So for instance, we keep reusing the same inventory location and store just to save some time, and we just have some hard-coded ID. This works fine. The problem is, what's going to happen when you figure out that, hey, an inventory location doesn't seem to work right once I have 1,000 items in there? Well, that might be a very important lesson to learn. If you have customers that are getting close to the 1,000 item mark, then it's very important to find those issues. On the other hand, if your biggest customer is at about 100 items, then you just found an issue that really isn't valuable right now for the organization to solve. Right? And you don't want to limit your testing by that. Every application is going to have limitations. And you're not going to fix those until it actually becomes a limitation that impacts your customers or could impact your customers. And that means that if your data becomes very lopsided because you keep reusing some of the same element and adding more and more and more stuff underneath it, now you have an issue, right? Now you're starting to find problems that are not important to fix, and you start creating noise and conflict in the organization. You don't want to do that. The other thing that's going to happen is that when you find this issue, a developer is going to come back and say, well, can you reproduce it in a smaller data set? Because for me to look at the issue you created, I have to dig through so much data that it just takes a lot of time. So that's the reason why I advise people to create new data. But creating new data has some issues. So let's take a look at those. So let's go to our features. Here is what the data creation would look like, right? We need to create a dealer because we have to create a dealer to create a store. And to create a user, we need our store. And we also need to create an inventory location because we want to create an item. Right? So we have a lot of noise going on, right? We don't really do anything with the dealer or the store or the inventory location. Right? Because we just want to create something, we want to have a user with certain permissions, and then we want to, do whatever the test actually ends up doing. It's not filled out in this scenario. But we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, at least 9 lines worth of noise going on in here. And what we've learned in the previous tutorials is how we can cut down on this noise. Because if we don't, this stuff ends up getting copy-pasted all over the place, and you'll create a maintenance nightmare for yourselves. So the first thing we learned is to fix the stuff down here, templates. Right? We now have a template of type spatula, and that fills out some of these additional fields. So we don't have to have these IDs hard-coded in here, and we can now maintain those IDs simply in a JSON file, which makes life a little bit easier and more maintainable. The next thing we learned is characteristics, right? We know how to not just have templates, but also use characteristics, which allows us to collapse some of the logic down here. And now we have an item of type spatula that is damaged. The last thing we learned is defaults, and that allows us to really cut down on this hierarchy. Right? And then if you like to, you can use implicit defaults where you don't have to type default all the time. And we end up with far less code to maintain. So even if this stuff gets copy-pasted, chances are that this is relevant information to the particular test you're dealing with, right? And chances are the functions are going to change depending on what kind of permissions you need to run your particular test. And that's kind of where all of this comes from. It's from a maintainability perspective for the longevity of your test suite. So let's take a look at what we actually have to do to make this possible. So if we go to our entities and we look at our dealer has not much going on. The most important thing is that we have our initialization of the default in here. Right, so this tells the dealer repository how to create the default dealer and that there is a default dealer. And then when it comes to the inventory location has a dealer, which is tagged over here with the default to repository default. And when we create a new inventory location, we call this decorate method, right? Repository.decorate new item. We pass in the inventory location. So when we initialize the default for our inventory location, we end up running it through this decorate new item, which will discover this attribute and will then ask and say, hey, do I have a default for the dealer? Because the dealer has not been populated. Right, so this is how these things start chaining together. And if we go up a level to the item has the inventory location. And when we create a new item, we have the same decorate new item happening. Right, so all of these different decorations work together. When you create an item and you decorate it, you discover that it needs an inventory location. When you ask the repositories for a default inventory location, you discover when you create an inventory location that you need a dealer. And that's when you ask the repository for a default dealer and you populate those different bits and pieces and it creates your object with the whole hierarchy in place. And when you create your user, it will need a store, but when you create your store, you find out that it needs a dealer, but you already have a dealer created, so the creation logic doesn't run again. It will just associate to the exact same dealer. And this is how you can leverage these different ideas that you've learned across the last few tutorials to really cut down on how much gherkin you have to maintain. I always advise people to minimize the amount of gherkin you have to maintain, and the reason for that is that your tooling for maintaining gherkin is far weaker than for maintaining C#. Right? If you have, well, let's put it this way. This little light bulb with all the options that you can do, they just don't exist for gherkin. Right? Gherkin is a glorified text editor. It has some formatting options, but there's no way to refactor things, right? You can't just say, find all the references, go to definition. You have some of the things, you can go to the step definition, but it's hard to find all the places steps are being referred to. So cutting down on how much gherkin you have is going to save you a lot of pain and suffering in the long run. Another reason why it's important is that your system will change. Right? So if at some point a user requires an account, well, then you now have to create an account, and now you have to pass that account to the user. But if you use defaults, you can most likely implement things without necessarily having to open up all of the existing tests you have and just say like, okay, well, the user has a default account, it will pull it out using our attributes, and all of our existing tests are automatically updated for this new entity that exists in our data structure and is now required. Right? You have to create new test cases. Right? You still have to create test cases where you actually specify exactly what kind of account you're dealing with for your user to be associated to. But you don't have to update all your test cases that refer to a user. That's really where these different concepts came from. This is really the reason that these are the first concepts we're talking about. is to try and cut down on the overall cost of what you have to do to write test cases and maintain test cases. Right? Because if you look at this scenario, we start the actual selling at line 24. Chances are most people are already stopped reading well before then. Whereas if we look at the final example, we start the selling at line 14. Right? And some of these lines we can't do anything about, like these three and this one over here. So we really cut down a lot of the clutter, and chances are that more people are going to be willing to read through the scenarios because they're more condensed, they're more to the point, and that also makes them more powerful as more people in the organization can review them, will review them, and can learn from them. Right? What you're creating is a body of knowledge, and this body of knowledge is going to be used across the entire organization at some point to understand and validate people's understanding of how the system works. And the more concise and easy it is to absorb this knowledge, the more valuable it is to the organization. This wraps up the tutorials for the basic setup from the core series. There will be more tutorials dealing with how to interact with websites. And please let me know what you thought about these tutorials and provide any feedback in the comments below. Thank you very much for your attention.